Okay, so here let's start with render method. Okay, so sorry, here goes helper. I need to do, as we discussed, I need to do two things over here. One, call base render method, and number two, I can do custom rendering. Okay, so I'm not doing any custom rendering exactly, just putting something in console.log so that we can assure later that yes, this function has been called. So this text is from render function which gets executed when component is initiated. Okay, so this is the custom rendering part. Whatever is your requirement, based on that you can do the custom rendering. I'm just printing this console.log statement to make sure that yes, this function is called, this function has been called when the component is initiated. Now to call the base render method, the syntax that we use is this dot super render. It says case sensitive, JavaScript is case sensitive. This dot super render. Okay, and you remember we discussed that render function has return type. Okay, so this dot super render has also got some return type. If I collect that in a variable a and return a, then it should work. Okay, I'm saving this. Now when my component is getting initiated in the Aura application, here my component is getting initiated. I should get that console.log text in the console. Okay, let's preview this. Inspecting, going to console. See, this text is from, okay, there is some spelling mistake. Let me fix it. Okay. Okay, so we can see this console.log. This text is from render function which gets executed when component is initiated. Okay, so now we understand that render function will get called whenever the component is initiated. Now let's talk about, and within this, this render function, first you call the base render method, and then whatever logic, whatever console, whatever custom rendering you want to do, you may do it here after this. Cool. So what custom rendering has to be done is totally based on the requirement. Okay, we have seen this render function. Now let's talk about after render. After render function gets executed after the when the execution for this render, when this render function is done, then after render function get executed. Okay, now I am overriding this after render function so that I can interact with the DOM elements. But first I will call base after method. Okay, so this dot super after render, here also this R should be capital. Okay, this dot after render, this will call the base after render method, and then I can interact with DOM elements. Let me just add one console.log. This text should come after render function is okay, or I can also add one more console.log. This text is from after render function or method. Fine. Now after this, let's test it. So I'm just saving my changes, going back to this registration form for students preview and refreshing this. See, first here the text from the render function comes. Once this is over, we can see the text coming from after render function. This text should come after render is over, after render function is over, and this text is from after render function. So first render function gets called when the component is initiated, and once the render function execution gets over, then after render function gets called. Alright, we are good. You know what? If you do not call the base render method, then see the preview. Okay, I think I have not saved it. Saving this. Now see the preview. See. Okay, let me return null over here. See, since you have not allowed the rendering service to call the standard render method, and even in your custom render, when in your custom render you have not defined any logic, okay, you have not defined any logic to create or manage the DOM elements of the component, it's throwing the error. So what we should do, we should call the base render method in our custom function. Okay, I should say in our render method. Okay, so we are good with render, we are good with after render. Let's talk about re-render. Re-render function, it's executed again. We'll first call the base re-render method. Okay, this dot super re-render. Okay, and then you can do custom re-rendering. Okay, so let me have one text here. This text is from Rerender function, which gets called whenever any data change occurs. Okay, so let's test it out. Saving my changes, going to the preview. So here you can see that the render function and after render functions, they are already executed, because they execute at time t equals to 0 and t equals to 0 plus delta t. They have already been executed. To execute re-render function, there should be a data change. And I know when I click on this checkbox, one of the attributes sets to true, and when I again uncheck it, then that particular attribute turns to false. You remember we put this logic. If you go to the component definition, we have this logic here. That's great, happy learning. This text, it comes when checkbox value is true. Okay, otherwise this text won't come. And when I click on the checkbox, on click checkbox function gets called, and in this on click checkbox function, I'm calling one helper function, on click checkbox helper, and in this on click checkbox helper function, I'm catching the value of the checkbox, and if it is true, then assigning true to this checkbox value attribute, and if it is false, then I'm assigning false to this attribute. Okay, so basically here data change occurs whenever we click on the checkbox. If checkbox is marked, that means checkbox value attribute is true. If checkbox is unchecked, it means checkbox value attribute is set to false. Okay, so whenever I click on the checkbox, there is a data change basically, and whenever there is any data change, we studied this, whenever there is any data change, then re-render function will get executed. Let's see. So this is the preview, and if I click on this checkbox, see, on click of this checkbox, first on click checkbox function get called in the controller resource. After that, helper function will get called, and when all this is over, or I should say when this helper function gets called, there is a change in the data. When this helper function is called, there is a change in the data, and as soon as there occurs any data change, the re-render function will call itself. And see, this text is from re-render function, which gets called whenever any data change occurs. So in the helper function, see, in the helper function, there is a change in the data on line number 11, and the moment some data gets changed, re-render function calls itself. Okay, So in the re-render function, first I call the base re-render method, and then whatever custom rendering I would like to do, I can do that. Okay,